The HOA built a chairlift right over Big Shaq's cabin, said it was harmless. But when quiet turned into control, Big Shaq didn't push back with protest. He answered with sound. Now every ride carries a chill, and what echoes through the pines makes them question everything they built. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. High above the tree line where the asphalt stopped and pine needles began, there sat a cabin so still it could be mistaken for a memory. That was Big Shaq's sanctuary, not Shaquille O'Neal the legend, not the former center with towering stats and endorsement deals, but the man beneath it all. Quiet, deliberate in his quiet. After years in stadiums echoing with cheers, he'd chosen the woods, where wind whispered and birds didn't ask for selfies. It wasn't that he hated people. He just finally understood the price of being everywhere all the time. His mother Lucille used to say, "When you've given the world everything, save what's left for your peace." She never needed to explain that. Not once. He carried that teaching into his adult life like a handwritten map to something sacred. So when he built his cabin in the White Hill Ridge, 2 hours from the nearest town, 6 hours from the noise of a real city, he didn't ask for permission. He just asked the land for patience. The mornings began with silence. No alarms, just the hum of the earth, stretching awake. Shaq would walk the perimeter of his land with coffee in hand, boots deep in pine needles, brushing snow from his carved railing like he was dusting off time. His cabin wasn't flash. It was dark wood, black steel windows, and a roof that whistled when the wind blew right. That sound, it reminded him of his mom humming gospel on Sunday mornings. By noon he'd split firewood, or oil the hinges on the smokehouse. Every action had a rhythm. The world out there chased speed. But up here, life was long form. He liked it that way. And the locals did too. They respected the ridge, not just because of the man on it, but because it hadn't been swallowed by strip malls or neon franchises. Not yet anyway. But stillness, as Shaq learned, has enemies. They came on a Thursday. Polished boots stepping out of a black SUV that didn't belong on gravel. A man and a woman, clipboard types, HOA representatives, though they called themselves environmental adaptation consultants. The title felt like plastic, shiny, flexible, ultimately disposable. The man had a tucked-in polo and a practiced smile. The woman wore sunglasses, like she didn't want to see what was real. They approached with the kind of confidence that doesn't ask, just assumes. "Mr. O'Neal," the man said, shaking Shaq's hand like he was doing him a favor. "We're surveying properties across the ridge for a new accessibility project. Chairlift installation, part of a community enhancement initiative funded by local tourism grants." Shaq didn't answer right away. He didn't like rushing his words. He looked at the map they unfolded, a grid that boxed the mountain like it was a spreadsheet. His cabin was marked with a red star. "You're sitting in what we call the tension zone," the woman added. "We're running lift cables overhead. Nothing too invasive. Just a route between Lookout Station and Ridge Point." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Overhead?" "Yes, sir, just airspace usage. The land underneath stays yours." The man said it like Shaq should be grateful. But Shaq had heard that tone before. A tone dressed in courtesy, but backed by erasure. That same voice used to ask his mother if they could borrow her porch to hang campaign flyers. It used to promise change if she just signed her name beneath someone else's idea of progress. He thanked them with a nod and said he'd think about it. They didn't give him paperwork to sign. They didn't ask for permission. They just got back into their SUV and disappeared down the trail like their job had already been done. That night, the silence felt thinner, as if something had been cracked open. In the following weeks, he noticed subtle changes. Pink surveyor flags along the outer edge of his property. A humming sound in the distance, generators maybe, or machines drilling into rock. He hiked out to the western ridge and found a clearing that hadn't been there before. Trees felled in tidy lines, bark still weeping. That wasn't clearing, that was conquest. He called the county office. They bounced in between departments. No one could give a straight answer. "All above board," one clerk assured him. "You're not losing your land, sir." But Shaq wasn't worried about losing land. He was watching it get hollowed out. One afternoon, a construction truck parked just beyond his gate. Two men in hard hats got out, walked to the boundary, stared up at the sky, then scribbled notes on a clipboard. When Shaq stepped outside, they acted like he wasn't there. "Private property," he said calmly. "We're just mapping lines," one muttered. Not here, you're not. They left, but the message was clear. This wasn't a negotiation. This was the quiet start of a push. He started writing things down. Every noise, every vehicle, every document he could pull from public access. It didn't make sense. The chairlift wasn't approved in last year's zoning updates. No environmental reports. No public hearing announcements. Just a quiet clause buried in a tourism development package signed 6 months ago. One line that allowed aerial transit development for eco-recreation purposes. A chairlift. Over his cabin. Over his peace. He could feel the shift in the mountain. Deer patterns changing. Owls gone from the southern ridge. Even the air smelled different, like soil that had been unsettled too fast. Still, Shaq didn't confront anyone. That wasn't his way. Lucille had told him once. Sometimes, letting them talk first is how you hear the lie before it forms. Instead, he built a bench at the edge of his porch and waited, watched, measured the hum of new machines, timed the shadows creeping closer across the ridge. In silence, he strategized. He'd dealt with giants on courts before. This wasn't all that different, except now, the scoreboard was the sky, and the referees didn't care who fouled first. And beneath the surface of that mountain, something else was wrong. Something he couldn't name yet, but felt deep in his ribs, like a pressure drop before a storm. The noise hadn't fully arrived, but its teeth were already sinking in. He wasn't afraid of confrontation, but he respected timing, so when the idea finally came to him, clever, simple, entirely legal, he almost smiled. Let them come. Let them run their cables and hoist their chairs. He wouldn't fight them with noise. He'd beat them with sound. And beneath that mountain sky, the silence that once healed now braced itself for war. Not with fists, but with echoes. Not with rage, but with resolve. The stillness before the noise had ended, and Big Shaq had just pressed record. The first tower rose before the second frost hit. It came in pieces, steel bones trucked in under fog, and silence welded together within hours. It hadn't been there when Shaq drank his morning coffee on the porch, but by sundown it stood tall and unnatural, casting a shadow across the southern slope of his cabin like a line in the sand. Shaq didn't move. He stood on his porch, arms folded, eyes tracking each crane, every truck, every uniform without a name tag. He'd dealt with bureaucrats before. But this was something else. This was fast. Too fast. The ridge had always been the kind of place where change moved slow, where trails were marked by hand, where town votes still happened in old school houses, with chalkboards that squeaked. But this operation was surgical. Trucks arrived before dawn hauling girders marked with codes, not company logos. Men in bright vests carried tablets instead of tools, speaking in clipped tones, avoiding eye contact like they'd been warned. Locals weren't consulted. No community notice was posted in Ridge Hollow. No open forum, not even a whispered rumor down at Blake's Diner where folks gossiped over sour coffee. Instead, a glossy flyer appeared at the post office one day. Coming soon. The Ridgeway Sky Trail. Eco-adventure for all ages. There was a drawing of a smiling family in a lift car, high above green woods. The artist rendering had airbrushed Shaq's cabin out of view. The next morning, 2 more towers went up. The construction site was fenced off with plastic barriers, but they didn't even bother putting up a "Do Not Enter" sign on Shaq's side, as if they didn't think he'd be a problem, as if he were just a silhouette on the map. Shaq walked the ridge at sunrise. No more deer, no more bird chatter, just the metal groan of beams settling and the constant ping of bolt guns. He stopped near Tower 3, tallest one yet, and looked up. The lift cables had already been stretched, taut and humming. He could see the chairs lined up down the line, still wrapped in plastic, but there were no stairs, no loading deck, no passenger safety signage, just a rough temporary path carved into the soil by machinery, not hikers. Tourism, they'd said. Shaq had done business long enough to know the difference between a public project and a private hustle. The lifts weren't prepped for riders. There was no ADA-compliant access ramp, no glass booths or security rails. These weren't scenic joyrides. They were transports. For what? He didn't know yet. But he knew this. They weren't meant to make people look around. They were built so no one would look down. He took photos, not with a phone, but a film camera, an old Nikon that couldn't be hacked or remotely wiped. He captured the crane logos, the equipment numbers, the tagless uniforms. Later he printed them in his cabin's darkroom, pinned them to a board, labeled everything, drew lines, connected trucks to towers, not for the police. He didn't trust them. This was for himself to stay ahead. By week's end, the cable cars began testing. They glided silently over his cabin, casting quick shadows through his kitchen window. The low rumble of their motors vibrated the glass. He followed the rhythm. Every 7 minutes one would pass. He stood beneath them, counting, watching. The passengers weren't tourists. They were crates, sealed, unlabeled, strapped in place. That was the first real signal. The second came in the form of silence. Workers who refused to meet his eyes. He'd offer a wave or a nod. No one returned it. One man, young, white-knuckled on a clipboard, whispered something to a coworker when he caught Shaq watching. They laughed nervously and walked faster. Then the permits vanished. He checked the county site again. No entry for Ridgeway Skytrail. No zoning updates. No safety inspection logs. The project didn't exist on paper. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't post online. That was what they expected. Rage, reaction, noise. Instead, he returned to the cabin and opened his old recording case from the storage closet. Inside were speakers. Serious ones. Weatherproof, low-frequency, high-fidelity units he used to test sound design for his studio projects years ago. He set them up in the trees around the edge of his roofline and linked them to a motion-triggered system. Next, he designed the track himself. Layered groans of twisted metal, snapped steel, cables fraying under strain. Subtle enough to sound real, random enough to feel terrifying. It didn't play continuously, only when a lift car passed directly overhead. That way, the reaction wouldn't be immediate. The unease would build slowly, person by person, ride by ride. By the third day, word spread through the mountain town. The lift sounds wrong. People described it as unstable, unpredictable. Some even claimed they felt the cable dip beneath them. A group of contractors rode up to inspect it and came back down white-faced, whispering about a core alignment issue. Still, the project continued, quietly, but with more caution. The HOA sent a letter, a friendly notice of concern about potential sound pollution. It didn't accuse him directly, but it didn't have to. They requested a meeting. Shaq declined. Instead, he built a second speaker rig, this one further down the slope, near the lift's main pylon. He planted it under moss and brush and adjusted the timing. Now it played a snapping noise, 2 seconds after the cars passed overhead, just enough to turn a moment of relief into a jolt of panic. Then came the night riders. He spotted them just past midnight, 2 cars passing slowly overhead, under cover of fog. The lift didn't operate after sundown, according to the flyer, but these were late hauls, moving in silence with only a faint red blink on each crate. Shaq watched from his window, camera in hand, recording the footage onto an old VHS system. Again, nothing digital. When he zoomed in, he saw the crates had been changed, reinforced. No visible lock. What was in them? Why the secrecy? Why now? A week later, a drone appeared, hovering at the edge of his roofline. It didn't scan or fly away. It stayed for 7 minutes, exactly 1 lift cycle, then zipped off toward the main site. He never saw it again. But the next day, 2 uniformed inspectors arrived claiming to be from the State Forestry Division. Their jackets were new. Their boots were clean. They didn't check a single tree. Shaq walked them out personally. They left behind tire tracks with military-grade treads. He didn't sleep much after that, but he didn't need to. He wasn't tired. He was watching, planning, listening to the mountains in a way no machine ever could. The speakers continued to play, but now he tweaked them, added variations. One played the sound of a bolt falling. Another emitted a low screech, like a distant metal stress fracture. Subtle, realistic, psychological warfare, 1 decibel at a time. By now, the workers were moving slower. The lift operators looked nervous. One refused to ride again after hearing something snap near Tower 5. The project stalled for 2 days, then resumed, but now with security. Real security, armed though discreet. It was escalating. Shaq knew he couldn't hold them off forever. But he didn't need forever. He needed time. Time to figure out what those crates were. Time to understand why his land, his specific ridge, had become the path for this silent transport line. Time to unearth what they were so desperate to keep above suspicion, and just out of reach. No one had threatened him yet. But he didn't need threats to know danger. He could feel it in the trees, how they stopped moving when the wind was supposed to blow, how the air pressed heavier with each tower that climbed higher above the earth. Steel in the sky. But something else was rising too. And Shaq, steady, quiet, patient, was ready to bring it all back down. Shaq's speakers, hidden in the trees and beneath the eaves of his cabin, weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The lift cars weren't running tours. They weren't packed with visitors snapping photos of the trees, so the sounds didn't need to compete with chat. They only needed to sound real, like metal giving under stress, like a system under pressure. And they did. It began with murmurs. A few town hikers returning from the ridge trail, talking about how the lift didn't feel right, that the cables shook more than they should. One guy swore he heard a bolt fall and hit something below. Another claimed the whole structure hummed like it was straining, especially when the wind picked up. No one could explain it. No one had seen anything wrong, but no one wanted to ride it twice either. Shaq didn't speak up. He didn't deny it, didn't confirm it. He just continued about his days, splitting wood, feeding the fire, walking the property line with his coffee and notebook, observing, listening, waiting. The sounds continued to play every time a car passed overhead. He adjusted the playback randomly, added new layers to mimic seasonal creaks, temperature stress, and the soft moan of strained cables. It was an orchestra of unease, inaudible to those below, but unmistakable to those above. By the second week, the HOA had filed a formal inquiry of disruption with the county. They called it localized interference, that seemed to coincide with lift operation, but they couldn't prove anything. The county responded with a vague statement about respecting property rights, and invited the HOA to provide technical evidence if they believed laws were being violated. No technician ever came to inspect the area. Shaq figured they didn't want inspectors asking too many questions about a lift system that didn't technically exist on public records. So the complaints turned to whispers. Locals at the general store started looking twice when Shaq walked in. Not disrespectfully, more like curiosity with an edge of caution. They'd seen the flyers, they'd heard the HOA's side of it, that Shaq was being difficult, obstructive, unwilling to share the land for community development. But Shaq had lived here long enough. His reputation wasn't built on noise. It was built on presence. Still, he noticed the shift. One morning, he found a pile of garbage dumped just inside his property line. Bags of construction waste, some torn open, nails spilling out into the moss. The tags on the bags read, Liftco Contracting LLC, a name he hadn't seen before. He took photos, logged the coordinates, and dragged the garbage to the edge of the road with a wooden sign. This isn't mine. I know who left it. By dusk, it was gone. Then came the fire safety notice. A white envelope nailed to his porch railing, with a printed warning, non-compliant chimney vent, risk of embers, order to inspect within 10 days or face fine. It wasn't signed, no agency seal, just a photocopied badge and a barcode that linked to a broken web page. Another scare tactic. Shaq didn't blink. Instead, he opened a folder on his desk labeled Incidents. He logged it, photos, dates, GPS stamp, a printed copy of the bogus notice. He scanned everything and stored it in both physical binders and encrypted drives locked in 2 separate safes. He wasn't preparing for court. He was preparing for truth, because truth properly documented becomes undeniable. At night, the sky was no longer quiet. Drones flew low, just above tray line, some equipped with thermal cams. He didn't shoot them down or throw rocks. He recorded them, time-stamped videos stored offline. Occasionally they'd hover above his porch light, casting his shadow against the wooden walls of his cabin, like a specter under surveillance. He didn't wave, he didn't move, just watched, still and calm as the pine. And through all this, the lift kept running. But still, no people. That detail didn't escape him. Every chair that passed overhead was either empty or carrying a crate. Always the same size. Always sealed. No markings, no tags. He had expected tourists. But weeks passed and he never saw a single visitor. Not even a test ride. It wasn't a theme ride. It was a conveyor belt. For what, he couldn't say. One afternoon, as the sun cut sideways through the trees, he watched a lift car slow unexpectedly overhead. The crate it carried wasn't strapped down the same way. It rocked slightly as if it weren't entirely solid. He listened closely. No sound came from it, but the air felt different, thicker somehow, like it was holding something back. He walked into his cabin and retrieved an old hunting scope from the closet. Not to aim, just to observe. He began tracking the crates, noting variations. Some had different bolts. Some were painted matte black. Others had faint signs of corrosion on the bottom edges. And then, one morning, he caught a flash. Something inside a half-secured crate, just visible through a gap in the cover. It looked like glass tubing. Not fragile. Industrial. Something about it made his stomach go still. This wasn't storage. It was transfer. Consistent. Daily. Untouched by human hands. And none of it was listed on any public or private development documentation. The HOA's retaliation efforts grew more aggressive in posture but still passive in practice. A survey crew came by, poking around trees near his eastern slope with metal rods and a dog that didn't bark. They claimed they were checking for old fencing markers. Shaq pointed them to the boundary line and asked if they needed a copy of his deed. They declined and left, but not before one of them slipped a small white card into his mailbox. On it was printed, "We can work with you. If you want out, now's the time." He added it to the folder. Later that week, a power outage hit his property alone. The electric company had no record of grid damage. His backup generator kicked in, but the signal was clear. They wanted to shake him. He tightened the perimeter, rechecked locks, set up backup surveillance, analog, battery-based, no blinking lights, no Wi-Fi, just wires and eyes. And always, the lift passed overhead. The audio system had done more than scare riders. It had disrupted the illusion. The HOA had designed the chairlift as a silent line, a presence too boring to question, too quiet to resist. Shaq's tactic didn't just add noise, it exposed vulnerability. It made people wonder, and wonder, unchecked, spreads fast. Soon, independent bloggers showed up, urban explorers, conspiracy chasers, even a drone hobbyist who posted a video titled "Why's the Ridgeway Lift Only Carrying Boxes?" It didn't go viral, but it circulated enough. Comments ranged from "it's a FEMA thing" to "definitely secret military tech." One user, under the name Steeple Agent, dropped GPS coordinates that matched Shaq's ridge exactly, and wrote, "This site used to be on federal maps back in '71, now it's blank." The comment disappeared hours later. Shaq printed it anyway. He hadn't planned to start a fire, but he didn't mind watching the smoke curl. And all the while he never raised his voice, never filed a complaint, never confronted the HOA reps who occasionally drove past, pretending not to glance at his cabin. His strategy wasn't defiance, it was exposure. Bit by bit he was peeling back their silence with sound, returning the noise to those who tried to bury it. The echo trap had been simple in design, but its reach was expanding. The more they tried to shut it down, the more questions spread, and that was the goal, not to prove them wrong in court, but to make sure they couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening.
Now all he needed was time.
And he was watching every second pass overhead. For 2 weeks he tracked the chairlift schedule, memorized its pauses and loops, the way it slowed on the eastern ridge where the track curved into a small clearing near the edge of state-marked land. A lift station had been built there, far from public roads, far from trail maps. It didn't appear on any municipal blueprint. No signage, no security fencing, just a low, squat metal building partially dug into the slope, hiding in plain sight. He timed his hike for the dead stretch between midnight and 2, when activity was thinnest, the sky cloud thick and moonless. The night carried an edge to it, cold and watching. As he climbed, he passed under the cables again, counted the crate, always 5 cars apart. The 6th chair carried cargo. Heavy, too heavy for sightseeing gear. The lines didn't sway, they groaned under the strain, a sound no tourism-grade lift should have survived without repair. By the time he reached the clearing, the wind had died down. The trees here were thinner. Shaq crouched behind a stack of unused lumber, scoping the lift station. It had no windows. One metal door, an access panel on the side with blinking lights too sophisticated for simple operations. As he watched, a lift car glided to a stop overhead. The crate disengaged automatically, sliding along a short rail and disappearing into the back of the station with a hydraulic hiss. Shaq moved closer, staying in the dark. He wasn't armed, didn't need to be. What he was carrying was curiosity sharper than fear. He reached the side wall, pressed his ear to the cold metal. Inside, no voices, just mechanical whirring, and then a low, pulsing hum. Not electrical, something deeper, contained. He followed the outer wall to a stack of rusted filing bins, left behind near the back of the station, almost like scrap. Most were empty, full of chewed wiring and dusty bolts. But one bin, locked with a busted latch, still had weight to it. Shaq pried it open with a crowbar from his bag and found several laminated binders inside, weatherproofed and sealed. He pulled one free. The cover read, Project Ridgeway Site. A Torside Transit, Containment Logistics, Level Legacy Compliance. He flipped through it fast but carefully. Charts, acronyms, blacked out pages, phrases like heat suppression threshold and thermal shielding container spec. One page showed a diagram of the lift cars, not with seats, but a mounted cage, designed to carry sealed crates, exactly like the ones floating overhead. The notes listed material resilience against hazmat Type 4 and Class C radiation protocols. Tourism? No chance. These weren't rides. They were routes, quiet ones, high above footpaths, off the record, out of view. He photographed every page, even the ones that looked meaningless. Then he resealed the binder, placed it back, and ducked into the tree line before the next car arrived. No cameras had followed him, no alarms triggered, but still he knew someone would eventually notice what he saw. If not tonight, then soon. Back at the cabin, Shaq spread the photos out on his dining table. Dozens of pages. He enlarged one image digitally, a schematic showing the flow of containers from Site B to what was labeled only as Vault D. The location was redacted, but the direction of the cable line pointed west toward federal-owned land that had been declared environmentally restricted years ago, supposedly due to landslides. He'd hiked that area once. There were no signs of a landslide, just odd fencing and an old road blocked by gravel mounds. Now, it made sense. Shaq turned off the lights and stood by the window. Overhead, another crate passed, humming silently under tension. It didn't matter what was in them. It mattered why they were lying about it. The HOA wasn't an association. Not really. It was a shell, a buffer, something between truth and liability. And now it was operating above his home, with the impunity of a ghost agency. The next day he made a plan. He drove down into town, parked at the library, and logged onto a public terminal. No phone, no digital trail. He searched every variation of containment logistics, lift-based transport, Project Ridgeway. Most results were useless. Shipping companies, fictional references. But on page 12 of one obscure search, he found a line buried in an old environmental ethics journal. Unverified accounts suggest post-Cold War remediation efforts utilized covert aerial systems to move outdated classified material from decommissioned containment sites under the guise of municipal transit development. It had one footnote. Source Anonymous Report 1998. Region, undisclosed. Common cover phrase, legacy compliance. Shaq leaned back in the chair. The phrase from the binder, not just policy speak. Cover language, something buried beneath bureaucracy and time. He printed the page, left no trace behind, and drove home without a word. That night he updated his archive. Printed backup copies, made off-grid duplicates. If anything happened to him, if someone tried to discredit or remove him, there would be records. But what haunted him wasn't the crates. It was the silence. The cold, curated quiet in which this had all unfolded. How many others had noticed and said nothing? How many had signed contracts not knowing what they were signing over? He remembered his mother's voice again. Lucille had a way of saying hard truths soft. They don't always need to steal your home. Sometimes they just steal what's under it. It stayed with him now. The idea that his land wasn't just valuable, it was useful. Not because of its view, but because of what it covered, and the convenient elevation it offered for aerial routes far from roads and reporters. And the lift cars, every one of them were the wrong kind of weight. He stopped the speaker rig for one night, just to listen, just to hear if the cables strained naturally, or if the real noise had always been something else. That night, a crate dropped overhead, slower than usual. It hovered above the cabin longer than it should have, then moved on. The mountain didn't groan, but something did. Deep low, almost like a breath, and Big Shaq knew then. This wasn't about obstruction anymore. This was about discovery, and they weren't going to stop just because the chairs made noise. They'd only stop if the world finally looked up and asked why they were flying sealed secrets over a man's peace. The next morning, he wrote a single line in his field notebook and circled it twice. This is not freight. It's removal. Because whatever was in those crates wasn't being delivered. It was being taken away. At 2:13 a.m., One of the lift cars jerked. Just slightly. A hard twitch in the wrong direction. The crate it carried slid half an inch in its bracket. Then the clamp beneath it gave a slow metallic shudder. The motion sensors picked up the anomaly, flashing a red alert on the internal control system. But no one was manning the station. The station was remote. It had always operated without oversight. Then the real sound came. A sharp metallic snap followed by a distant thud. Shaq felt it before he heard it. The kind of low reverberation that travels through the earth. He rushed outside, flashlight in hand, boots sinking into the muck. Through the rain, he spotted it, a single lift car dangling, one cable frayed, and dancing wildly in the wind. The crate below half crushed against the rocky slope, just past Tower 7. Steam or smoke hissed from the base, but there was no fire. The trees hadn't caught. The air was thick with tension, not heat. No sirens followed. No team rushed in. Just silence. Then within the hour, the quiet buzz of drones. Not search and rescue. Not utility crews. Just small, fast and watching. By dawn the footage had surfaced online. A drone hobbyist had been flying the night before, recording weather patterns near the ridge. His camera caught the lift car's sudden lurch, and the slow-motion derailment. It didn't show the crate's contents, but it caught enough. The failure of the cable, the impact, the fact that the system malfunctioned above private property. Within hours the HOA responded. Not with a press release, but with targeted statements leaked to sympathetic local media outlets. The narrative was swift and sharp. Shaquille O'Neal, they said, had been tampering with lift operations. They implied he'd been using illegal equipment, disrupting structural integrity with unauthorized sound-based interference. The words were deliberate. They didn't accuse, they suggested. But it was enough. The town paper printed a headline that morning. Lift collapse or sabotage, Ridge resident under scrutiny. Talk radio ran with it. The host called Shaq a recluse with a chip on his shoulder, said he'd refused to work with the HOA, and questioned why a man with so much money would live in a cabin so far from normal oversight. The unspoken charge was clear: he didn't belong here. He never had. The sting wasn't in the headlines. It was in the calls that didn't come. Neighbors who used to wave at the grocery store stopped looking him in the eye. A woman he once helped jumpstart her car at the gas station crossed to the other aisle when he entered. Not out of fear, out of quiet accusation. And all the while the HOA remained silent. No investigation team came up. No emergency crew to examine the wreck. Within 2 days, the crushed crate had vanished, removed under the cover of more storms. The tower was patched hastily, the cables reset, and the lift continued as if nothing had happened. Shaq didn't respond, not publicly. Instead, he opened Lucille's Bible. He hadn't touched it in months, not since the last snowfall, when he sat by the fire and reread the old Psalms she'd underlined. But that morning, he needed something real, something rooted. He flipped to the back cover where she used to keep folded papers, receipts, photos, handwritten prayers, and tucked between the final page and the backboard, he found a folded yellowed sheet of paper wrapped in tissue and sealed with a corner of wax. It was a deed, handwritten, dated, signed in ink now faded to brown. The document traced ownership of the land back 3 generations. Not just the cabin plot, but the entire southern ridge, including the path where the lift cables now hovered. The title was issued under a pre-absorption township law, older than any zoning rule the HOA had cited. And at the bottom, in his mother's script, a note: if they ever come for what we didn't sell, let them try explaining this in court. You don't owe them permission for peace. He read it twice, then again. The ink shook slightly where she'd written, but the line beneath her words was straight and hard. Lucille had always known they'd come back for it one day. He scanned the deed, made 6 copies, and placed them in safety envelopes, marked with a return address in Nashville, his attorney's office. The original stayed locked in the safe behind the bookshelf. This wasn't just about proving ownership. This was about legacy. His family had held this land through segregation, redlining, and decades of systemic theft Mex's legal advancement. He wasn't about to let them rewrite the truth with spin and steel. But what gnawed at him wasn't the collapse, or even the blame. It was the crate, the way it hit the rocks, how fast it was removed, and what little footage escaped before it was scrubbed. He'd managed to freeze a few frames from the drone video before it vanished off streaming sites, and in one frame, just as the crate tore open on impact, a glimpse of something emerged. Blackened casing, stamped with a symbol he didn't recognize. Not a company logo. Something else. Circular. Geometric. He sent the image to a retired contractor he knew from his playing days. A man who once oversaw federal infrastructure projects. The response came hours later, just 5 words. "Where the hell did you get this?" Shaq didn't reply. Instead, he returned to the ridge and sat beneath Tower 7, where the crate had landed. The grass was burned, not by fire but by something chemical. There was no smell, just dead earth. And above it the cable cars glided like nothing had ever gone wrong. He thought of Lucille then, her voice echoing from memory, soft and unshaken. Sometimes, to protect peace, you have to disrupt silence. He understood now. The silence had never been neutral. It had been curated, controlled, manufactured by people who depended on others staying quiet while they buried their secrets under someone else's sky. That night, Shaq recorded his own video. Not a rant, not a defense. He stood outside his cabin, snow falling lightly, and simply spoke. "This land's been in my family since before they paved the roads around it. They want you to think I'm the problem, that I'm unstable, angry. The truth is, they didn't expect anyone to be watching. But I am. I see what's passing overhead, and I'm not the only one anymore." He didn't name the HOA. Didn't point fingers. He didn't have to. He uploaded the video to 3 separate servers, scheduled it for release, if his phone went silent for more than 72 hours. Then he waited. The world hadn't caught fire, but it was beginning to crack. The snow was falling in fine, dry powder when Shaq slipped out from his cabin, dressed in dark thermal layers and wrapped in silence. It was close to 3 a.m., and the wind barely moved, as if the entire ridge were bracing for something unsaid. He had waited for days, studied the schedule, tracked the patterns. There was always a brief 2-hour window before sunrise when the chairlift operations paused. During that lull, everything went still, the perfect time for ghosts to emerge, and for truths to be pulled from the ground. He moved along the tray line with practiced care, snow muffling his steps. His target wasn't the operational station, but the older one, half collapsed and hidden behind Tower 1, a skeletal building long written off as abandoned. Officially, it had been decommissioned years ago, but Shaq didn't trust anything labeled abandoned by people who didn't want questions asked. The land it sat on was unclaimed, not part of any public registry, and bordered by barbed wire so rusted it looked like it was pretending to protect something. He reached the rear of the building, its side wall sagging inward from rot, and pried open a loose sheet of corrugated steel, with a quiet groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust and dry insulation. Shaq's flashlight beam cut through it, revealing concrete walls covered in old moss, ceiling panels sagging like they'd given up holding secrets. But it was the floor that drew his attention, scored by recent tire tracks leading toward a sealed elevator shaft. The keypad beside it blinked red, dead and cold. A panel below it had been forced open, wires exposed and snipped. Someone had been here, and not long ago. He followed the tracks to a back corridor, the walls narrowing, leading to a staircase that dropped sharply beneath the building. At the bottom, a metal hatch. He pulled the locking wheel slowly, until it gave with a reluctant click, and the door opened into a corridor lit by dim emergency strips that still hummed faintly with power. The deeper he walked, the more the world above seemed to vanish. The walls were thick, painted a sterile off-white that had yellowed over time. Then, at the end of the corridor, a steel door with no handle, only a single sign bolted into the wall beside it. Restricted access, authorized personnel only. Underneath, barely visible in the corroded metal, someone had scratched 4 words with what looked like a nail. "Ashes never stay buried." Shaq pried the door open with his shoulder, and entered the room beyond. It wasn't large, but it was packed rows of metal drums stacked along the walls, painted military green with yellow stenciled symbols, biohazard insignias, radiation warnings, and serial numbers that didn't match any commercial registry. The air inside was heavy, metallic, the kind of air that settled in your lungs, refusing to leave. Near the far corner, a locked cabinet had already been forced open, its hinges bent. Inside, a stack of old boxes and crumbling files, their edges blackened by time and moisture. He pulled one out, its label smeared but mostly legible. Project Astonishing Fall Ridge Containment. He placed it on the nearby table, brushed off the dust, and opened it. Inside were maps, real ones, not digital renderings, but hand-drawn plots, showing underground waste sites, chemical storage zones, and notes about non-consented disposal zones that overlapped perfectly with where the HOA's lift now ran. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a cover. The crate transports weren't bringing anything in.
They were taking something out.
Page after page documented how, in the early 1960s, several private contractors had partnered with government cleanup units to dispose of military-grade toxins, failed chemical agents, radiation test residue, and decommissioned experiment material. But when regulations tightened in the 70s, and funding dried up, the containers had simply been buried, right there, under the ridge, left to decay, and forgotten, until now. One memo, stamped in red, outlined a containment breach in 1983. Minor leakage. Nothing actionable, according to the document. But beneath the memo, a handwritten note in faded ink, warned, secondary ground contamination is probable. Recommend long-term burial until removal logistics are viable. Viable. As in when no one's watching. Shaq felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't just about land. This wasn't even about money. This was about removal. A decades-long mistake quietly being unmade, without drawing attention. The chairlift? It was a sanitized pipeline, a perfect route through unregulated airspace, above unmonitored forest, right over the cabin of a man who was never supposed to notice. And the HOA? It wasn't a community board. It was a front designed to look harmless suburban. It had legal authority, just enough to operate without scrutiny, to pressure landowners into silence with bylaws and vague policy threats. But beneath the smiling reps and pastel pamphlets was a machine moving poison away from the mountain, and erasing its history in the process. He pulled out his phone, not connected to any network, and snapped every page, every diagram, every label on those drums. He even filmed a short video of the storage room, narrating in a low whisper, "This is underneath Ridge Station 1. No guards, no public record. Military drums stacked 3 deep. Radiation warnings, unaccounted disposal notes. This is Project Ashfall, and the HOA chairlift is the extraction system." Then he closed the folder, placed it back and retraced his steps, careful to leave no sign he'd been there. By the time he reached the surface, the sky had begun to pale with early morning light. Back at the cabin, he cataloged everything. The truth wasn't just ugly, it was radioactive. The most dangerous part wasn't the waste. It was the realization that they weren't planning to stop. They were moving the materials now, because they feared discovery. Someone up the chain had given a quiet go-ahead, and once the removal was done, they'd tear the lift down, flatten the land, and rezone the ridge into whatever suburban dream they had planned. Shaq printed copies of the documents, watermarked them with time-stamped GPS metadata, and mailed them to 3 different journalists he trusted from past charity work. People who had nothing to gain, and too much integrity to ignore what he was about to drop on them. And still he said nothing. Because the next move wasn't his. It would be theirs when they realized something was leaking. Not from the drums, but from the cracks in their cover. That evening, a new letter appeared on his porch. No envelope, just a sheet of red paper folded once, placed beneath a smooth river stone. It read, "You've gone too far. You want war? You'll get pressure instead." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Shaq folded the letter, slipped it into his incident file, and returned to the bench outside. He looked up at the lift. The cars still moved, crates still hung, and somewhere, someone believed this story would stay buried. That time would eat the evidence, and silence the watchers. But they'd made one mistake. They ran their lies over the wrong man's roof. Shaq had stayed up all night, eyes bloodshot but locked on the upload progress bar, crawling across his old laptop screen. The file everything he'd found at the decommissioned station. Photos, documents, videos, audio clips and annotated maps compressed and encrypted, then sent in a timed package to a podcast host who didn't play by corporate rules. Her name was Vita Rowe, and she ran a rogue broadcast called Truth Drift, followed by a few 100,000 listeners who didn't trust headlines and read footnotes for fun. Shaq hadn't contacted her directly. That would have been too risky. Instead, he uploaded the packet to a ghost folder on an independent server she'd mentioned in an old episode about data suppression and disappearing evidence. He didn't write a message. He didn't need to. The files spoke for themselves. By sunrise, the episode dropped. No warning. No teaser. Just a ping and then, "We've received something big. It's about a place you won't find on any map, and the man they're trying to erase from it." Within 2 hours, downloads spiked. By 4, regional networks picked up on it. Not the big stations, not yet, but the mid-tier blogs, the subreddits, the independent investigators who connected dots, while the rest of the world waited for permission to look. At first it felt like the clouds had cracked. But then came the knock. It was a hard one. Not urgent, but entitled. Like whoever was on the other side didn't expect to be refused. Shaq stood in the center of his cabin, eyes on the door, heart calm but alert. The knock came again, followed by a clipped voice. Inspection notice. Ridge Fire Safety Division. Step outside, please. There was no fire safety division on the ridge. He opened the door slow. 2 men stood on his porch. One in an olive utility jacket with a patch that didn't match any government office, the other holding a clipboard with blank forms. Behind them, a dark SUV idled. Engine hot. Shaq didn't step back. He didn't offer a greeting. "You're not from any registered agency," he said flatly. "We've received a report of electrical hazards in the area. Potential fire code violations. Need to check your system for compliance." Shaq didn't blink. "Got a warrant?" The man with the clipboard smiled. "This is administrative. You can show us what we need, or we can note your refusal." They stepped forward like it was already decided. Shaq let them in, not because he trusted them, but because he needed to know what they were really after. They moved quickly, checking nothing, touching too much. One stayed near the breaker panel. The other wandered toward the shelf near the safe. Shaq watched as his fingers trailed too long over the edge of the wood. 20 minutes later, they were gone, and so was the deed. He didn't react right away. He didn't even touch the shelf. He simply walked outside and watched the SUV disappear down the trail. Then, without turning back to the cabin, he walked to the tool shed, flipped the false panel on the workbench, and pulled out his backup. A second deed, identical, signed by Lucille, notarized, aged but intact, still in its envelope, sealed tight. He'd made a copy the day after finding the original, because Lucille always taught him, what's real is only yours if you protect it twice. He placed the copy in a fireproof box, buried it 6 feet deep behind the east fence line. Then he covered the hole and walked inside, closing the door just as the lights blinked out. The power didn't go off like an outage. It dropped, hard, total. The hum of the refrigerator, the security system, even the generator circuit, all went silent in a way that didn't feel technical. Shaq checked the breaker. Nothing tripped. Outside, no downed lines, just darkness. And the mountain, once again quiet, but this time, like it was waiting. He fired up a portable battery pack and switched on the emergency radio. Static. Switched bands. More static. The blackout wasn't just his. It was local. The ridge was being choked. He walked to the cabinet, pulled out a recorder the size of a paperback. No Wi-Fi. No Bluetooth. Just a digital mic. Time-stamped, with manual file saves. He hit record and spoke into the mic slowly, clearly. "If you're hearing this, the ground you're standing on is borrowed time. There's a facility under Ridge Station 1. There are containers in it that shouldn't exist. They're being moved, quietly, illegally, and they've erased every paper trail but one. Mine. They've taken my power, they've taken my files. If they try to take me, remember this. I was never the threat. The silence was." He saved the file and uploaded it to a secure private server, one that triggered automatic release across multiple platforms if he failed to log in within 72 hours. A dead man's switch. He wasn't ready to die, but he wasn't ready to be erased either. Then, a knock at the back window. Not loud, just 3 taps. He turned slowly. A figure stood outside, hooded, small frame, holding something pressed to the glass. A phone screen. On it, a single message written in white font on a red background. "We saw the episode. We believe you." Shaq opened the door a crack. The figure stepped back. A young woman, early 20s, dark braids, sharp eyes. 2 others waited at the tree line, scanning with scopes. No weapons, just watchers. "We're with Pine Sentinels," she whispered. "Student-run group. Environmental data trackers. You uploaded something Vita flagged for high risk. We traced the lift path. The waste you documented. It's not isolated." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "How far does it go?" She held up a printed map. Marked in red were dozens of dots across 3 states, all tied to the same pattern: decommissioned stations, hidden lift lines, off-grid removal routes. Everywhere they buried something they couldn't report. Shaq exhaled slowly. Then they'll come for you next. She nodded. Let them. We're not ghosts. We're light. And once truth's out in the open, it burns fast. He handed her the backup drive. Get this out. Everywhere. If I don't check in 3 days, pull the ripcord. She took it, slipped it into a waterproof pouch, and disappeared into the trees with the others. For the first time in weeks, Shaq sat, not because he was tired, because he understood. He wasn't fighting for just his land anymore. He was fighting for every acre buried under silence. And now he wasn't whispering through the pines alone. Protesters had started gathering near the logging access roads that fed into the slope below Shaq's cabin. They weren't loud, not yet, but their presence carried weight. Banners reading, "Not just trees, lives below," flapped in the wind. Others held cardboard signs with spray-painted messages, "What's in the crates?" and "Stop the silent extraction." The episode from Truth Drift had been picked up by an environmental watchdog blog, then fed through social threads and shortwave amateur broadcasts. Within 72 hours, it went viral. Not through polished media, but through the gritty, determined sharing of people who'd spent too long being dismissed. Activists, journalists, digital detectives, each one grabbing a different thread from Shaq's leaks, following maps, tracking coordinates, confirming connections. But the match that lit the fire came from above. Not from Shaq, not from Veda, not even from Pine Sentinels. It came from a Skycam. A freelance documentarian named Ellis Trapp had flown his thermal drone over the ridge at dawn, hoping to capture landscape footage for a piece on ghost towns. What he caught instead was a live feed of Tower 10, a high segment of the chairlift route, rarely seen from the ground, leaking something thick and black from the base of a crate mid-transport. The vapor slithered down into the air, not smoke, not steam. It shimmered in the morning light like oil suspended in wind. His drone got within 50 feet before the camera flickered, then blacked out entirely. But not before the image uploaded. The frame showed the crate bleeding. Subtle, silent, undeniable. That was the moment silence failed. By midday, reporters were trying to get through the blocked county roads. Emergency services claimed a safety training exercise was underway, but no drills looked like this. Hazmat-suited crews moving fast, armed with sealed canisters, working under the open hum of military-grade helicopters that didn't carry press credentials, no warning sirens, just quiet urgency, and men who didn't wear names. From his cabin, Shaq watched it unfold. He stood in the doorway, binoculars in hand, eyes locked on the tree line where Tower 10 sat hidden just beyond the crest. The lift had stopped. The cars hung in stillness, but he could see the disturbance, shadows shifting where no wind moved. He knew it then. Something had gone wrong. For real this time. His radio crackled to life. "Big Shaq, this is Saul from Pine Team. We've got eyes on black suit units near Tower 10. Full containment crew. Masks. Containment bags. We're pulling out, but they're circling your side now. You need to go. Now." Shaq didn't ask questions. He pulled his pre-packed emergency bag from beneath the floorboards, zipped his laptop into a hardened case, and activated the Deadman upload again, set to release a second, more detailed data drop if triggered. Then he opened a hidden hatch beneath the cabin and stepped into the crawl tunnel that led half a mile downhill beneath the ridge. The tunnel was old, dug during the early construction of his cabin, originally for drainage, later reinforced for escape. He'd never used it before. Now it felt like the only honest hallway on the mountain. By the time he emerged near the east slope, Saul and 2 others were waiting. Young climbers with gear strapped to their backs and fire in their eyes. They didn't say much, just nodded, handed him a mask, and pointed to the rope ladder descending from the rocks. "Media's catching up," Saul whispered, as they hiked. "You've got 1 shot to be off the ridge before they spin this." "What about the protest line?" Shaq asked, voice low. "They've blocked off both roads. Press can't reach them. But they know. They're staying. They're filming." Shaq nodded once. He didn't need to be a symbol. He just needed to stay standing. Behind them, the air shifted. A dull groan echoed up the mountain. Then a crack. They turned just in time to see the top of Tower 10 buckle slightly at the joint, like an old man's knee giving out. The crate it held pitched sideways. One support cable snapped, not fully severed, but enough to send the lift car swinging violently. A piece of metal clanged against the tower and fell, striking the rocks below with a clang that felt too final. Emergency crews scrambled, shouting now, sirens at last, late not to warn the people. but to cover the sound of failure. They were losing control. Saul snapped a photo, then tucked the phone into a secure pouch. Now or never, she muttered. The descent was sharp, the trail narrow, but Shaq's steps never faltered. His legs, built for courts, now moved like roots down a slope, anchored, steady, strong. When they reached the tree line, a small drone hovered overhead. It wasn't hostile, just watching. A black model, civilian-coded, and linked to a nearby live stream. Shaq looked straight into it and nodded once. That moment would become the frame that traveled across the internet in the next 48 hours. Shaq towering, calm, flanked by young activists in weather-worn coats, stepping off the ridge as the chaos unfolded above. Behind them the lift stuttered, then ground to a full stop. That night, national coverage exploded. Major outlets, finally catching the scent of something they couldn't afford to ignore, aired composite footage from Ellis's drone, protester streams, and the leaked data files, now circulating under the hashtag #AnshashFallTruth. The story was out in the open. The Ridge Chairlift project was a front for toxic extraction. The HOA, already known by locals as mysterious, was revealed as a shell corporation, linked to a series of dissolved logistics firms with former federal contracts. No public records tied the group to government entities, but the trails were too neat to be coincident. The backlash was immediate. State investigations were announced. Lawmakers made statements they'd avoided for months. Legal teams scrambled. Anonymous whistleblowers came forward. And within 24 hours, the HOA vanished. Offices emptied, phone lines cut, websites scrubbed, but not fast enough. The truth had cracked the surface. And like the crates buried under years of silence, it could no longer be hidden. Shaq sat in a temporary safe house that night, an old ranger cabin miles away from his own, watching the news scroll across a dusty television screen. His face didn't show in the headlines. The stories focused on the leak, the evidence, the collapse, but his presence echoed in every word. A man who didn't run, a man who watched, waited, and pressed record. He wasn't angry. He was awake. And for the first time in months, the mountain finally breathed again. When Shaq stepped out of the truck and set his boots back onto the ridge, he felt it instantly, an absence where weight had once hung. Not just the steel cables, but the unease that ran with them. It was gone. He took a deep breath and closed the door gently behind him. Gravel crunched beneath his soles as he walked up the familiar trail. Pines bent softly in the breeze. Squirrels darted between roots. The wildlife had returned like they'd been watching from the edges, waiting for permission, waiting for the world to quiet down. It had been 4 months since the lift buckled. 4 months since the protest broke the silence, and the truth clawed its way out of buried crates and legal misdirection. The media frenzy had slowed, but the scars were still being measured by lawmakers, by journalists, by the families who learned that their homes were built over once forgotten dumping grounds. Investigations were still underway, depositions filed, names sealed, but the ridge was clean. The towers were dismantled, and the HOA, what was left of it, hadn't been heard from again. The cabin stood exactly as he'd left it, not untouched by weather, but unbothered by intrusion. The porch carried wind-worn dust. The mailbox door was ajar, rusted at the hinge, but no one had broken in. No cameras, no wires, no signs of quiet surveillance, just pine cones on the roof, and a faded welcome mat that still read, "Keep it simple." He stepped inside and paused. The air smelled like memory, cedar and stone. A hint of ash, the ghost of Lucille's old Sunday stew clinging to the walls, like it never left. He ran a hand over the kitchen counter, brushing off the thin layer of time, then turned slowly toward the living room. Everything was where it belonged. The chair, the firewood stack, the radio, unplugged but ready. A sanctuary not disturbed, but preserved. He unpacked slowly, not because he needed to, but because he could. Outside, the sun arced high, stretching over the trailhead like a crown. It was there he saw it. New wood, clean and freshly stained, mounted between 2 granite stones near the base of the trail. A plaque. He walked toward it, heart still, gaze steady. Etched in brass, plain but proud. This land is protected. Because one man didn't let noise drown out truth. No name, no date. Just the message. Shaq ran his fingers across the metal. It was smooth, untouched by weather yet, but it would wear with time. That was good. Truth should be weathered. It made it real. He turned and looked up the hill, where the first speaker had once been nailed to the pine. The spot was empty now, Bark heeled over. The speaker had been removed weeks ago, carried off by one of the young sentinels who asked to keep it as a relic, proof that sound could shake more than just the air. Shaq gathered some tools from the shed and returned to that spot. He laid down a small bench, nothing fancy, just thick wood and smooth grain, bolted into stone. He built it exactly where that speaker had once sat, and when he finished he sat on it without ceremony, facing the open sky. It didn't make a sound anymore. It didn't need to. The silence was different now. It wasn't the stillness of suppression or warning. It was earned. It carried no fear, only clarity. He thought of Lucille, of the way she used to fold laundry while watching the horizon, as if she were waiting for history to come back around and test her patience. She had always told him, peace ain't a place, baby. It's a promise. You just gotta keep your end of it. He had, at a cost. He still carried the weight of being watched, of knowing how close it had come to being rewritten, erased. But the cabin had stood, the mountain had endured, and he had kept his end of the promise. That evening, as dusk spread soft orange across the ridge, Shaq lit a single lantern and sat outside. No laptop, no scanner, no surveillance. Just a journal and a pen. He wrote one sentence on the first page. They buried the wrong thing under the wrong man's land. Then closed it. That was enough for now. The ground beneath him had been poisoned once. Not just by waste, but by indifference, by the arrogance of those who thought a hidden route through an old mountain would stay quiet forever. They were wrong. The mountain remembered. And now, so did everyone else. Some truths don't knock. They hum overhead. If you've ever wondered what's buried under the silence, you're already part of this story. Stay awake. Stay watching. Because the next ridge might be your backyard.